we're going to talk about data collection today from a variety of standpoints. Kind of what we're going to try and do, what I'm going to try and do here is we're going to kind of work through, I'll start out with kind of making this, for those of you who haven't worked with network data before, kind of translate the problems we want to handle into kind of questions you're used to thinking about, but what we're going to realize very quickly as we talk about those problems is the way we think about and address them in the networks world is quite different than in kind of more traditional survey sorts of environments. So the network kind of sampling and measurement issues is where we'll start out, which will lead to this big question of what is known as the boundary specification problem. And I will say up front that these kind of two main bullets in that secondary bullet there, I've seen them presented in basically any order you could think about. I feel like these are topics that are kind of best read written on a ball. There's no kind of start or end point. And so this is the way I find it easiest, but it might have made sense to go the other way. Anyway, we'll talk briefly about some kind of platforms for data collection, a really brief aside on ethics in S&A because I know you have an entire session on it later in the week. But I don't feel like I can talk about network data collection without at least talking about ethics a little bit. So I'll talk really briefly about that. And then we'll probably spend a fair amount of time in thinking about assessing the quality of social network data in a variety of formats. So we'll start out with the kind of network sampling question. But before we do, I wanted to mention kind of the approach to what I'm going to try and go over here. And that is really what I'm going to try and talk about are the principles that govern how we collect network data rather than giving you a set of kind of rules of what you should follow. Because to be perfectly frank, a lot of answers to these principles are kind of the things you want to do with them really depends on your question, your data collection environment, and these sorts of things. So I'm going to kind of set up the problems you should be considering, give you a handful of ways that people address those, and the kind of furthering of how you'll go about that and actually doing your own data collection will probably depend a lot on kind of digging into literature on those particular topics. But it'll give a kind of good start. So a few things I want to mention with respect to that is I'm probably going to talk a lot as though we are collecting data with surveys. That's not to indicate that the problems we're talking about generally today don't also apply to all other data collection formats, or said in the positive. We should think of what I'm talking about as applying for everything, any strategy for collecting network data, not just for surveys. It applies very equally to qualitative and quantitative data collection kind of principles. You'll probably hear me tend towards quantitative ideas, but the same principles would carry over and have implications for qualitative work as well. And I will probably split out, there's lots of ways that this gets talked about, but I'll probably split out data collection into kind of passive data collection in the networks world and active data collection in the networks world. And the types of questions we're addressing today apply to all of those as well. And this is where what I'm saying is there are a lot of different opinions on kind of how solutions within these principles get applied, and they really depend on a lot of things like research questions and other, am I like stepping in front of the speaker? No, okay. So there's lots of different kind of ways that these get applied. So I'll give a handful of kind of rules of thumb, but you shouldn't necessarily think of these as kind of tried and true and tested best practices. So as a result, if at any point it's going to be useful, feel free to kind of interrupt and ask questions as we go along today. I think it'll probably be useful in a number of ways for us to have some discussion around some of these topics rather than just me talking for 90 minutes. So to start out, I think we generally kind of start with some network in principle that we're interested in studying, and we want to then ask the question of how much of that or what portions of this do we want to capture. And the reality is, in kind of relational analysis broadly, or networks specifically that you'll hear this week, there are a lot of strategies we can take to addressing that particular set. Realizing the colors show up really funny on this screen, but we'll make do. So we could start out, and there are a lot of really good research projects out there that focus primarily at the dyadic level, right? So we could sample dyads throughout a population and analyze relational kind of structures in a dyadic context, and so that's one strategy. And we'll kind of think about that a lot in the way we talk about measurement today. I won't talk about that a lot in the way I talk about sampling, but it'll be one of the levels we could think about. One of the others that Jim talked about that you all heard some about yesterday is an ego network strategy, right? So an ego network strategy starts with this little blue node in the center, and then it finds all the people they're connected to and composition of those things and relationships amongst those nodes. And so we'll talk about ego network strategies a little bit as well. We could have data that is focused on, a question that is focused on analyzing subgroups in a population. So this little graph on the right is from Katrina response in New Orleans that Carter Butts and some of his grad students at the time collected. And it was primarily kind of via telephone calls. And this group on the right, if I remember correctly, was like within one firm. I don't remember exactly, but so you could analyze a portion of the population you're interested in based on some external attribute. And so this subgroup might be who we're actually interested in. And we could study things like that. We could also start from our ego in the middle, the little blue node that we started from, and then we could sample out from that some number of steps via link tracing, right? So what is blue on your handout version of the slides would be that ego plus the people they're connected to 1 step away, or the green one 2 steps away, et cetera, out to the entire population that we could get to via link tracing. But you'll notice if we follow link tracing, we're not going to get all these disconnected groups, subgraphs outside of that, which we'll talk a little bit about too. We could also take and try to analyze what gets referred to as a complete network. And you'll notice in a lot of my slides, whenever I say complete, I put it in quotes because our complete networks are almost never truly complete for a variety of reasons. But the idea behind a complete network is try and capture the entire population of nodes that we have within some boundary, and then try and enumerate all the ties that exist within those, or among those. So the aims that you have for your questions, kind of theoretically and empirically, will end up governing kind of where you select within this, but each one of these choices will have implications for both how we sample the population that we're going to try and study, and then how we try and measure the relationships within that population. So you will see a lot of different kind of implications of this as we work our way through. So I'm going to start out with what we kind of talk about as network sampling, and kind of set this up kind of in parallel to the way Jim presented it yesterday, where we will talk about kind of ego networks as one kind of end of the spectrum, complete networks as the other end, and what we frequently get referred to as kind of partial or adaptive sampling strategies as kind of existing somewhere in the middle. But when we talk about ego networks, what the data are attempting to do is identify some respondent, some ego, right, and the people they're connected to that we refer to as alters, right? And the key aims usually in ego networks are somehow enumerating and describing the characteristics of some ego's alter set, right? And you'll get this afternoon about a bunch on kind of how to think about analyzing ego networks. So I'm just going to talk about here kind of how we think about collecting ego networks. So in ego networks, you generally start with what is known as a name generator, right? And a name generator is simply a means for identifying which connections you are attempting to enumerate within the population. And probably the most commonly known general name generator in the ego networks world is from the General Social Survey, where they collect what is referred to as the kind of important matters network question, which asks over the last 6 months, from time to time, most people discuss important matters with other people. Tell me who those people are for you over the last 6 months, right? And so this is thought to capture a variety of things about kind of local social support that's available to people, and we'll come back to this question a number of times throughout the presentation. But this is kind of one way you could think about what a name generator does. This gets who people talk to about important things, right? There's tons and tons and tons of examples of ego network data out there. I'm going to, at times today, talk about one that I was involved in called the Malawi Diffusion and Ideational Change Project, which has since changed names to the MLSFH, which I actually don't know what the acronym stands for, on fertility and HIV in Malawi in particular. The NHSLS is one that I kind of read a lot about when I was in grad school. Indianapolis Network Mental Health Study, you'll hear about some later today, but there's tons and tons of ego network data sets out there. So flipping to the other side in terms of sampling, we could, instead of focusing around a single node and the people they're connected to, we could be interested in studying an entire population. So this is a good place for me to mention. If you grabbed the slides from that they posted prior to this morning, you got an old version of them. I updated them, corrected some errors, and also I intended to include a bunch of hidden slides that are in here in your handout that elaborate on some of these ideas a little bit further. So just mentioning you might want to re-grab them this morning. So complete networks, instead of focusing around a single node, as we identify some population. This is data from the classic Coleman, Katz, and Menzel study. You're familiar with this project? Some of you, none of you, a few of you. This is a study of physicians in mostly Illinois. Were all 4 sites in Illinois? I think all 4 sites were Illinois, where they gathered data about kind of interactions amongst physicians around the time of when tetracycline rolled out as a drug, and kind of studied the diffusion of adoption of prescribing tetracycline. And so the CKM data are one that a lot of us use. So these would be for a lot of us use for kind of teaching and demonstration purposes at this point. So this would be the population of physicians in one of those towns, and then what we're interested in doing in a complete network design is enumerating all of the relationships amongst all of the people in that sample, right? And as I mentioned, I will be kind of asking the question along the way today about kind of how complete we can think of that word all as actually being. Jim talked a bit yesterday about ad health as one of the really common examples of these sorts of data. I don't know how much we're actually going to talk about the Framingham Heart study in my slides. I can't think of too many examples, but it's something it might not be a bad idea for us to tick back to as questions come up. But we're increasingly seeing a variety of other kind of full, complete network data sets available out there. So the kind of third option we have is the one that kind of sits somewhere in between. Right, and so it usually gets described as kind of partial because it's neither ego nor complete network data sets. And it's an approach that is particularly common for hard to identify or enumerate populations. And you'll hear some kind of adaptations of this later when Ashton talks about RDS. But basically in partial network designs, what happens is you start with some sample of nodes, right, these 10 people, and then after interviewing them and they identify some of their partners, you try and then turn their named partners into additional respondents in the population as well, right? And you can repeat this out some number of times until you get some estimation of the entire population, right? And so the colors from this particular example can show kind of parts of the graph that would have been sampled and parts of the graph that would not have been sampled depending on how you follow out that link tracing pattern. There's a handful of these. I mean, there's quite a few of these out there, but they're particularly common in studies of disease tracing. One thing I want to kind of back up and mention is how we kind of identify and recruit this next wave of respondents in partial network designs often has a lot of different strategies. Some more principled than others. We could have what's known as a random walk, where if you name 4 people, right, and I only have the money or the time or the resources to follow up on 2 of them, how I choose which 2 could be randomly selected. I could focus on ties that have some particular attribute, those that are either stronger or weaker for some reason. I could do a complete census and try and trace all of them. There's lots of different strategies that lead to lots of different implications. One thing I want to kind of highlight when we talk about partial network designs is if we're following link tracing, it really matters where your initial set of seeds start from, right? So if I pick 10 people and they're all in this component, no matter how long I follow that link tracing out, I'm never going to get to those other disconnected components. And so partial network samples very kind of focusedly think about how the initial set of seeds are going to kind of implicate what they can actually get out of the data that results. So, sampling is one that we're going to kind of talk about here up front in kind of that level of detail, and it'll come back in as we talk about other parts of this. So I just want to kind of highlight what we've done so far. We've talked about kind of local and ego network data sets are focused on the data are focused on the respondent and the people they're connected to. The kind of complete network designs are intended to study kind of all of the actors in a potential population and the relationships that exist within the boundaries between them inside that boundary. Here we're trying to define kind of the entire population and enumerate all of those ties in the network structure there. As I mentioned, it's not absolutely complete. So it has some different kind of principles analytically that you'll see over the next couple of days. And then kind of the third approach being the partial network design. Sorry, why I keep looking at the screen is I haven't adjusted this. I can actually see now. So the partial network design provides some tracing across a variety of stages in tracing out through the contacts that are enumerated in a population and tries to identify things about frequently kind of more hidden or lesser known lesser easily identified populations. So we're going to kind of shift now from thinking about which nodes we want to study and which relationships we want to study to how we actually study those things. So you'll see this part of it will kind of trace over both kind of ego and complete and partial network designs in a variety of ways. But what we're going to kind of focus on really is kind of what the stuff of those relationships are and how we capture the stuff of those relationships as we try and measure these things empirically. So this is straight cut and paste of what the general social survey actually looks like, because I think sometimes just thinking about what instruments look like is particularly helpful for working through data collection questions. And so this is the general social survey important matters question that I read over before. And then they ask people just to provide the names of these individuals. And for an ego network design, they don't need to be names that like you as a researcher could actually identify who these people are. What they ask them to do is provide something that the individual who's providing those responses will be able to kind of remember when you come back to these people later to ask follow-up questions. So they can be initials, they can be nicknames, they can be what have you. But so long as the respondent can kind of recall exactly who we're talking about later in the survey, we'll be okay in what goes into these names. And so one of the first things we can do with this type of data is simply ask how many people are named, right? And so kind of sizes of social networks is a question that frequently comes up. How many of you have seen the social isolation paper? And I know you have, Ashton, thanks. So there was this big social isolation paper that came out in American Sociological Review in about 2006. And basically what they did was they took the general social survey question that we had in the previous slide, this one, and it had been conducted in the general social survey, which is a nationally representative population-based sample in the US. And so in 1985, they had a distribution of the number of people reported on important matters that looked about like this. All right, so mean was somewhere between 2 and 3, about 10% reported nobody. A handful of people, even though the instrument only provided for 5 names, some people still responded with more than 5 people. Right? So this is something that will happen even when you have kind of implicit caps. What happened in 2004? No? Yes. Two big things happened. Shift to the left. In general, a shift to the left. And we'll talk about this difference a lot as we go through things today, where you had more than a doubling of the people who reported having no important matters discussion partners in the 2004 data. And like I said, we'll come back to that. This we aren't going to talk about. This left shift seems to have been replicated a lot of times. The isolates we'll loop back to a number of times. So people have asked a variety of these questions, and it goes back to one of the kind of initial kind of considerations that people in networks were frequently interested in. Kind of how large is an average person's social network, or how many friends should I have is another way that Scott Feld has asked this question. And so Poole and Cohen kind of were some of the people who started out with kind of working out this idea, and from a purely mathematical model of a variety of things, they estimated kind of several hundred, 500 was their number. And then people started to want to empirically test this, and so they came up with lots of strategies over time. One of my personal favorites, and the one where we've kind of labeled this name as existing, with the name of this phenomenon is the Dunbar number, is Robin Dunbar took and analyzed interaction patterns amongst primates, and saw kind of what the size of kind of interaction groups amongst primates typically was. I forget exactly which one he was starting with. And then he basically did kind of a projection up based on neocortex size to estimate how many friends he would expect people to have based on those interaction patterns. And he estimated the number to be about 150. And I jokingly include that he then replicated this by asking people how many Christmas cards they sent out each year and confirmed his estimation. I jokingly say that because he's done it a lot more kind of systematically, a lot of ways more systematically than the Christmas card replication, but it was a kind of fun first step. So when I show this frequently particularly to undergrads, they're like, there's no way that number is only 150. That's way too low for a lot of reasons. And I'll step through that in just a second. But a lot of other people have subsequently tried to kind of re-estimate this in a variety of ways. Probably the most popular of which is a strategy that is known as the network scale-up method. Ashton, are you going to talk about InSum at all later? I didn't think so. Okay. So the network scale-up method briefly is we can take and ask people questions about things that have known quantities in the population. And then from those, we can kind of calibrate how frequently people are reporting those numbers to those things that actually exist in the population. And then we can scale up the estimates when they report on other things that are unknown to estimate what those unknown numbers would be. And so InSum allows, via that approach, to estimate just how many friends someone might have. And Bernard and Kilbert did some work, a lot of other people have as well. But if you notice, the kind of range of estimates that we're looking at here aren't that dissimilar from what we've seen previously. They're doubling or so, but on the kind of order of magnitude question, they're more or less in the same range. So my students always look at this and they're like, those numbers are way too low. So Facebook is the one they always think about. Here's the funny kind of punchline on Facebook. If you look across the entire sample there, the numbers more or less correspond to what these estimates provide offline as well. So if we're just talking about, usually these are thought to be kind of, if you were walking down the street and saw somebody you recognized by face and started to talk to them, would they recognize you as well? And you could have like a brief conversation and know each other. These are kind of what these are thought to be capturing. So how do we do this? There's lots of ways to do this. You saw the one in the ego network design from the GSS. Here's what the ad health looked like. They had a long set of prompts, a long scripted prompt, and they asked people to then name their 5 best male and 5 best female friends. And these were high school kids in the 90s, so they were very used to kind of Scantrons and bubble sheets. So they were then able to just look in a flip book of who the students were in their actual classroom and be able to identify, hey, this is my friend, and then they'd bubble in those friends. Right, so they have a complete roster of the potential people they could name as friends, and we'll talk about how complete those rosters frequently are later as well, and then bubble in kind of who they identify as their friends. So they did this for male and female friends, and they did it for romantic partners over the last 18 months in ad health. And there are plenty of other studies that have done similar things in lots of different strategies, and I'm not sure why that's on the bottom of that slide. This is probably legacy of cutting and pasting from somewhere else. So, Nangrong's a really cool study, though, which I'm guessing around here some of you might be quite familiar with, probably more so than myself. So in the local or ego network data collection kind of approach, after you have enumerated kind of who people are connected to, we often then step into asking what are known, on top of these name generator questions, what are known as name interpreter questions. And what a name interpreter question is attempting to do is not just estimate who you're connected to, but what are the features of those people that you're connected to in a variety of ways. And so this is just one kind of mocked up example from Tom Valente, who's presenting later in the week, where basically for each of those people who you've named, we then follow up and ask questions like, how do you know them? So this is a relationship, this is a question about the characteristic of the relationships, right? How close are they? Then there are frequently in ego network designs, not just characteristics of the relationships we try and estimate from the respondent about their partners, but we also ask them to report characteristics of those alters, right? So their gender, their smoking, not surprising, Tom is gonna have smoking in here. Tom's done a lot of great work on smoking and peer influences therein. So we could think about basically, from this slide, what I feel like you should probably take away is there are 2 primary kind of types of name interpreter questions we frequently look at. One, attributes of the alters, because if you think about an ego network design, if I am sampling respondents, asking them about the relationships they have to others, those people they're talking about are not going to be part of my study. So if I want to know anything about who that person is connected to and what the kind of similarities between them or dissimilarities between them or composition amongst the alters is going to look like, then I need to get that information from somewhere, and the respondent's going to be the only source of that in an ego network design. Right, so the first kind of type is the kind of alter attributes, and then we also frequently get something about kind of relational attributes. What are the kind of natures of the relationships between the ego and the alters that we are sampling here? Any questions on generators, interpreters? This is a good place to pause for a moment. So a third thing that frequently happens when we're collecting ego network data is we don't just ask people to estimate who they're connected to, but we frequently ask them to estimate the relationships amongst their alters, right? So this is from the MDICP, the Malawi Diffusion Ideational Change project that I was talking about earlier, where we did exactly that. We asked people to nominate kind of the 3 people they most commonly talk to about issues related to HIV or AIDS. And then once we've elicited those network partners so they could name up to 4 people, we then ask them to estimate kind of what are the relationships amongst those people you named as partners. Are they confidants? Are they friends? Are they acquaintances? Do they not know each other, et cetera? And so we're getting an estimate not just of who I'm connected to, but how well those people are connected to one another, so we can get estimates of things like local network density that you'll talk about, or other sorts of things about kind of the relational structure around these individuals. And so this kind of pattern here that you have, if you notice, this is a table where I'm only asking these questions for kind of the top half of the matrix, and that's because basically we're assuming that this is an undirected relationship, right? I'm asking people, do these two people know each other? We're assuming it is the same on either direction. For some relationships, you might want to estimate them in a directed sense, so you might have the bottom half of the matrix as well. Does person one send money to person two? Does person two send money to person one, which would be a different potential relationship? And in this particular project, that's actually something we've done in families, asking about kind of how people support one another financially through disbursements of money. So you could have both directed and undirected estimates of the relationships amongst alters in an ego network design. So one additional thing I want to mention is we've increasingly seen, for a long time, what you saw when you were collecting network data was surveys that looked like this, right? So you had questions and answers, and you just kind of followed a script as you worked your way through. But what we're increasingly seeing is kind of a turn back to recognizing that actually collecting network data can leverage the structure of a network as potentially informative in the actual data collection process. So this is an old image from Lynn Freeman where they actually did this with like pegboards and push pins and rubber bands, where they actually asked people to kind of put themselves in this network and then the people they were connected to, and then ties were linked around them. But we've seen adapted versions of this kind of pop back up. This is a paper from about, more than a decade ago now, where they did this kind of on paper, and they had all these Post-its, and they took these kind of concentric circles, and they asked people to kind of put onto the page who your friends are, how close are they to you, right? So the close friends are kind of in the middle of the circle, the kind of weaker friends are further out, and you can kind of then be able to take these and do things like identify which set of people are kind of in groups where they all kind of know one another. We can do that in a kind of big proxy there, or we could do it directly, asking people who are, we could ask the respondent to name who is directly connected to who else within your network. And so we can convert this kind of concentric set of relationships to this kind of network image that you're used to looking at. But all of these are ego networks. This is just the relationship around the node ego who would be at the center. And in this type of visualization, you'll see very commonly when people visualize ego networks that they exclude ego from the representation. And so that's what's happened here. Otherwise, it would just be a mess of ties all from the ego out, in addition to the structure around them. And I'm not going to talk about this in detail because we actually have you all have a presentation after this on Network Canvas, but usually when I'm talking about this elsewhere, I will talk about kind of ways that these strategies here that were kind of somewhat primitive have been adapted for use on like touchscreens, et cetera. And so Net Canvas, they'll be talking about that later. Trying to figure out how much detail to go into about this. So there's a few ways we can think about what we might want to capture in terms of a network. And one of the questions that very commonly kind of pops up in this sort of literature is how many name generators or how many relationships do I want to attempt to gather in any one study? The classic answer to this for a lot of studies for a long time was one. We would have one particular relationship type that we'd be spending a lot of our time focusing on, but the reality is sometimes that one relationship is particularly useful, sometimes it's not. Sometimes we're interested in how relationships are kind of related to one another. So we could have, this is from a paper by Steve Borgatti and some of his colleagues, where they kind of thought about different kind of classes of relationships, and you can kind of think of the specificity increasing as you move kind of further to the right. So you have kind of relational stuff here in the middle that sociologists and anthropologists have spent a lot of time doing, similarities which Jim has spent a lot of time doing. There's lots of other people too, but I think you do a lot of, I can remember you doing a lot of this. Interactions, we can think of these as more specific relationships, right? Those people who one has sex with, has had a specific conversation with, et cetera. And these, what you can kind of think of is, as you kind of move across the level of specificity from the left to the right, is sometimes what you really want is over here, but what's accessible to you in terms of actually collecting data is kind of something further to the left. So we often end up kind of proxying certain relationships we actually empirically are interested in with other relationships that we actually potentially have access to. So in the world of kind of studying sexually transmitted infections, what we want to know is how frequently somebody is having contact of what type with someone else on what date and who's infected when, so that we could actually trace these things out. Now, how realistic is that for collecting data? Not very, right? So we usually proxy this with something like who are your actual partners, or maybe even who have you had a relationship with over the last 18 months, right? And so we have to kind of estimate the things further to the right from the things further to the left. The other thing that frequently comes up when we do this is we're increasingly seeing within studies interest in focusing on kind of the relationships the associations between types of relationships. So a single study interested in kind of how social relationships are related to sexual relationships or what have you. Sorry, all of my examples end up back in the sexual world because when I collected most data, that's what I've been focusing on. But we can think about these a lot of different ways. So the kind of main thing I want to say there with respect to name generators is it's increasingly common to use multiples, but the reality in data collection is frequently that we are not exactly capturing the level of what we want to do analytically. We're having to kind of move up a level of generality somehow in working on these sorts of things. So I like this representation just to kind of think about those levels and how they kind of implicate what we're going to be able to do within any one study. Show you an example of that in the next slide. This is a fun paper from Ali Marin and Keith Hampton that came out in Field Methods a little while ago, where basically, when we're looking at that kind of general social survey question, a lot of people have been asking kind of what does that important matters question actually capture? And so the important matters question for a long time had kind of more or less been thought to kind of proxy people's close available social support networks, right? And the reality was there were a lot of name generators that existed out there that tried to do the same thing in a variety of different ways. And so what this paper did was they had a survey where they were able to compare kind of a lot of those different approximations of those close potential personal social support networks and see how correlated they are with one another. And so this is the important matters question. This is somebody they had given, I don't remember whether this is given or received help from in the last 6 months, but it's one of those. Somebody they could loan money, they could ask for a loan of money to, somebody they just interact with socially. One of the classic ones is if you needed a cup of sugar, is there someone you could go ask, right? So there's lots of different ways of thinking about these sorts of questions. And what you see is there's not like perfect correlation between these, but there's some strong overlap in a variety of the different ways for proxying kind of who it is that one's connected to. And I forget what MMG and MGR are, so we'll skip over that for right now. But the basic idea that they came away from this is these things are related, but definitely not capturing the same thing. So different name generators ultimately lead you to different interpretations of the same kind of estimates of data that you might be interested in. So looking into kind of how these things have been used by others can be very informative in kind of what you can expect to get out of the data you might gather that way, is what I took as the punchline from this. And so here's an example of this. This is a paper from Nathan Eagle, David Lazar, and there's somebody in the middle whose name I'm going to Sandy Pentland, where they had, which one's which? I can do this. This is phone call data. This is self-reported social, oh, nope, other way. This is phone call data. This is phone call data. This is self-reported social relationships. So basically what they did was they had an ability to kind of to record who was kind of directly interacting with one another. I believe this particular study with cell phones, it might have been through those like moat sensors that people wear around their neck. I forget which one this one exactly is. But basically what we have is kind of a behavioral estimate of networks on the top. So who is it that I can empirically demonstrate have been interacting with one another over time, right? And that's what we're asking here. And at the bottom, this is if I take a survey and ask people to report who their friends are in the same group, we get a slightly different estimate. What the paper concludes is if we do now an analysis of the comparison between these two things, kind of at the dyad level, the amount of the information that we get from either one of these approaches is more or less the same, right? So most of the relationships that appear here, and vice versa. So if I just think about dyad level questions, I get pretty good estimates of similar things depending on kind of my approximation of who is potentially friends with one another based on their interaction patterns as an observer from the outside, compared to what they themselves say about who are their friends within this group. Now, while that might be true about kind of what happens at the dyad level, if we look at this as a network level question, we actually have some relatively different network structural features here, right? Probably the most obvious is this one's split up into two components, this one's not. So if we thought about kind of dropping an idea into this population and figured out who could learn about it from the others directly from this network, we'd reach really different conclusions up here than we would down here. There's some things that you'll talk about this week that are quite similar across these, so like the transitivity ratio, what the likelihood of a friend being a friend is quite similar across these two estimates, but some other things are substantially different depending on which one of these networks we work with. So this has led people to do a variety of things when we have multiple estimates of relationships within the same population. We could, in theory, if we think that both of these are good proxies of the same thing, maybe what we really want to do is not rely on only one of them, we could put them together. right, and get a good estimate of the relationships that truly exist among this population from both of those things together. Or we might think that kind of the joint presence of both of them would be useful. And so there are different ways we can think about using kind of multiplex relationships in the same data source as informative for the types of questions we might be interested in. We also could do, as I was mentioning in the previous slide, kind of predict one from the other. Instead of thinking of them as competing estimates of the same thing, we could think of them as fundamentally capturing something different and try and predict one from the other, which we see a lot of out there as well right now. So ultimately, the answer to the question that's kind of what is going to be more useful here is going to be up to what your question is in the first place. I don't have a good answer to that, and that's kind of, if you look at the exchange between these, that's where we both kind of came down. So we've been hinting, as I've been working through this, at a couple of principles that I would like to make a little bit more explicit in kind of thinking about how we measure social network relationships. So the first thing, the first one of these kind of principles I think I'll mention, in addition to some that have already come up, is the notion of whether or not we want to cap the number of nominations people have the capacity to provide. And so in social network studies, it's become pretty common for people to cap these at kind of some range between 3 and 6. 5 is probably the most commonly observed cap that I've seen. And the question of kind of where these caps came from is pretty fuzzy. There's some good reasons for some of them, and other places I think we've just adopted it because, well, other people were doing 5. And so thinking a little bit about this explicitly I think is useful, particularly because when we start to introduce caps, you can end up inducing both ceiling and or floor effects. Particularly if you use kind of explicit instead of implicit caps. So if I say, name your 5 best male and female friends, what might happen here? We could do something that has been suggested, might be true in some ad health data, is we might have deflated how much homophily we see in networks, because if I say name your 5 best male and female friends, people might be primed to name more opposite sex friends than they would have if they had not heard name your 5 best male and female friends, right? So the way we ask the question can actually alter the data that comes out of that. And so sometimes when we look at ad health, there still is strong gender homophily in there, but it is a little bit weaker than you see in some other studies for probably some of that reason. And so that's what we would think of as kind of floor effect. What you've done is kind of artificially inflated the kind of minimal number of reports that somebody would provide. The other thing it can obviously do is it can create a ceiling effect, right? So if I have an explicit or even an implicit cap in the way I study things, if there's somebody who's going to name 20 people and I only let them name 5, then we've artificially cut off the tail of the distribution in some ways. And so caps can be very useful. One thing that Jim mentioned yesterday is that network data collection becomes very time intensive very quickly, because as soon as you introduce a name generator, any name interpreters that come off of that are going to have the same number. They're going to have n times the number of questions you have. So if you have 5 nominations allowed, every interpreter question is going to be asked for 5 different people, right? So network data collection becomes kind of complex very quickly. So sometimes caps are just pragmatically useful to be able to actually get at the things you're interested in, rather than kind of getting at the breadth of who one's connected to. So this, like I said, this isn't meant to be necessarily a criticism of the cap approach. It's just saying, by introducing caps, there are things you're also going to alter in the data that you get out of this that you should be thinking pretty hard about how that's going to implicate what you actually want to do. Chris McCarty at the University of Florida has done a fair amount of work kind of showing that the different size of the alter set you allow to be incorporated into people's nominations can lead to pretty substantially different composition or structural interpretations of the network data that come out. So this is, if we just kind of look at so what's along the x-axis here is the number of alters that are named in a respondent set, and each inside any one graph, you've got some estimates of whatever kind of characteristic is. We'll just talk about centrality for the moment. And what I want you to focus on are the dashed line and the solid line. And what you see is the centrality kind of estimates lead to very different kind of conclusions depending on how truncated our respondent set is. So if I kind of draw a line from here and say, if I only have 5 people and I ask kind of what's my estimate of centrality going to be, it's going to be very different than if I had a larger number of alters from kind of complete network version in the solid line or a truncated version in the dashed line. And so what they've concluded is And a lot of their studies, they're kind of arguing for kind of a very high cap in the number of alters that you're going to ask each respondent to report on. 45 is actually the number he frequently tosses around for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons they have these large numbers is what we've increasingly recognized is when you ask people to report on the relationships they have, what they do is they start out in a cluster. Right? So I name one person, and as soon as I've named that person, the next 3 people that are going to rattle off for me are going to be the people they're close to. Right? And so I'm going to name people who are going to be very kind of tightly connected in one part of my network. And if I don't elicit a large number of alters, I might have a problem of kind of artificially kind of isolating the data I have available to me inside kind of one of my friendship clusters. Or if you kind of think of it as kind of work, home, family sorts of things, I might get one of those and not the other 2. Right? And so what they've identified is kind of allowing for larger sets of these reports to be allowed, to be elicited, allows us to kind of skip across those different clusters and get a fuller representation of ego networks. The reality is that any one of these strategies is frequently going to introduce biases that are going to be associated not just with attributes, but frequently with network structural features. So one thing we've learned, particularly in kind of cap network studies, is often you'll end up kind of artificially kind of not artificially, you'll get a kind of underrepresentation, of both those who are kind of the least popular in a network and the most popular in a network in terms of namings, because, well, you might kind of missample the people at kind of the bottom ends of those distributions. You might just miss them in terms of if I only allow a certain number of nominations, they might not get far enough down their list to name those people who are more isolated. And the popular people, you can end up with kind of deflated estimates of their inclusion in these networks as well. I was just going to mention real quickly that Jeff Smith and Jim Moody have done a lot of work kind of thinking about these questions along the way, so please. Yeah, and that's very common. So what was asked was, can you kind of do data collection where you have kind of a name generator that elicits numbers that go on to who knows how many, or unlimited in theory, and then do kind of name interpreter questions only over a subsample thereof. That's a very common practice, and the question then becomes, how? Like, how do you choose which ones to kind of focus on? And the unfortunate answer to that is, it depends on your research question, but probably the most common one is we know that people, when they are reporting on their alters in their ego networks, they frequently kind of prioritize them. I won't say exactly by kind of closeness, but there does tend to be a kind of correlation with the rank ordering of the importance to them. So you might start from the top and go down as a result if you just want the close ties to kind of weaker ones. Another thing that particularly kind of Chris McCarty and Amber Wutich, one of his former students, has done a lot of is you could then kind of selectively choose people who kind of cross specific domains. So pick the people who represent these 3 characteristics from the 40 people you just named, and then we do name interpreters over those 5 people or what have you. So the strategies for how you can combine those things are something people have thought a lot about out there. Like I said, Amber Wutich is one person I know has spent a lot of time thinking about that question. And Brea might have some other suggestions later too. Other questions at this point? Okay. So a few other kind of just broad considerations that I think are useful to think about. This goes till when? 10:30, right? Is what we're scheduled-ish for? Okay. So a handful of other considerations I think are worthwhile to mention here is what I refer to as kind of the specificity versus the generality kind of consideration in relationships. And this captures a whole bunch of things. But one of them is timing. We've increasingly learned that the more specific you ask people to be about the time window within which they are reporting about their partners, the more accurate that data tends to be. If you give them kind of fuzzy windows, they're likely to give you fuzzier estimates of those relationships. And that's in part just due to kind of anchoring in the way people think about things. If you give them something precise, they have ways to kind of actually leverage what's going on in that world better than if you don't provide that specificity. Another kind of specificity question is one that we ran into a little bit of a problem with in the MDICP data is, if you remember, I told you the way we asked the question was, name for us kind of the 3 or 4 people that you talk to about HIV-related matters. Right? what we have realized is that you don't really, in asking a question that way, you don't really know kind of what the denominator is. And what I mean by that is, I don't know if you name 3 people who you discuss HIV with, whether these are people you're kind of close friends with, and you just so happen to talk about HIV with those people, or these are people you rarely see, but they're the only ones you talk to about HIV, right? And the implications of those 2 different types of people would be very, very different for interpreting kind of what's coming out of that. So as a result, we have name interpreter questions that allowed us to estimate those things on the back end, but the reality is these name generators can kind of lead you down different pathways very quickly. And we'll talk a little bit sometime later, I don't remember where it is in slides, about some other ways to deal with that kind of denominator problem. Another question that very regularly comes up in collecting network data is the question of the difference between free recall versus roster-based estimates, right? So a free recall approach is just saying, who are the 5 people you've talked to about important matters over the last 6 months, and then you've got blanks and people just tell you who they are. Or we could have roster-based where you actually have the ability to kind of check off members from a population. Each one of these leads to kind of different trade-offs, right? Free recall is a little bit tougher on the brain, like just being able to remember names. I don't know about you, but I've started forgetting names of people I've known for 15 years. So the reality of being able to kind of pluck those from memory is sometimes more difficult when we rely on free recall. So there are limitations to that, but a roster-based approach, we've also seen, has a tendency to sometimes inflate the reports that people provide. They start to just check, if all I gotta do is check off a box, they start to kind of respond with people that they might be less close to than if we have a different strategy. So each one of these kind of leads to different trade-offs in some data collection potential limitations, and also just in terms of the pragmatics of doing data collection, if you want to do a roster-based approach, it requires a lot more kind of lead-up time before you can actually field a useful instrument, because you have to figure out how to enumerate a useful roster to be able to elicit from the population. So these different things have implications, and something we're increasingly seeing, particularly with kind of the increasing use of digital technology in eliciting network data, is you're frequently seeing kind of rosters that are kind of updating as you go and start to kind of name more people you can start to include them in, and NetCanvas has some strategies for being able to do that you'll hear about later. Oh, this is where the denominator thing comes in right here. I couldn't remember where I added it. It's on this slide. One way we can think about estimating relationships that are potentially nested in certain ways, right? So who are my friends? Who are my friends that I talk about HIV with? Who are my friends that I talk about particular behaviors to protect from HIV with, right? Different types of questions that are subsets of one another. Is we could just have kind of binary questions. We could try and ask people to estimate these in kind of valued ways. Steve Borgatti has made some suggestions that it might be more useful to rely on kind of nested questions, right? Who have you seen in the last 6 months? So how often do you see these people? So this is a valued version of this question, but if we just started right here, we might get a different estimate than if we start here and then kind of build into the kind of more close estimation of those relationships. Or we could kind of order them where we say kind of who have you seen in the last year, last month, last week, so we make these kind of more precise as we work our way down to help identify kind of how the various roster nominations we might get might be related to one another. That's the way we can think about that kind of working out. Another question that frequently comes up, and I don't have a lot of stuff in this presentation where I'm explicitly focusing on longitudinal data collection, in large part because a lot of what we're doing kind of matters kind of as you take each wave or take kind of behavioral estimates kind of through time is slightly different. But one thing that people have spent a fair amount of time on in kind of thinking about network data collection is, if I am doing kind of a panel-based study, what do I want to do with previous nominations? So Devin Brewer pointed out that if we take and kind of seed the interview in subsequent waves with information about who you named in the previous wave, it can lead to slightly different estimates. Sometimes it's just a matter of I forgot somebody that I was connected to then and I'm now connected to still, right? So if I have 2 different panel waves and I don't prime these people, my memory is such that it's very likely that we're going to seem to have network turnover in my network, simply because I remember the people that you might be interested in differently at wave 2 than I did at wave 1. And so one of the things he was suggesting is if you're doing like a free recall data collection strategy, you ask people to free recall at wave 2, and then when they're done with that, they say, well, last time we talked, you named these 3 people. Is that relationship's ongoing? over or what have you. For certain types of relationships, that makes a lot of sense and can lead you to not make erroneous conclusions about ended relationships and things like that. So because of the complications of collecting network data, the reality is we're frequently faced, even more so in network data, with the trade-off between breadth and depth possibilities of kind of how many relationships can I gather, how much can I gather about those relationships, and we usually have to kind of try and thread the needle of which one of these are more interesting to our particular project. Because of the timing limitations of what we can actually do in the field or in scraping data or whatever capacities that we're trying to focus on. So the kind of reality here is, for most of these questions, I don't have kind of a single answer of what's best and what's worst. I have pretest, pretest, pretest on your condition, on your question, on your site, so you can start to get understandings of how different choices are going to lead you down different paths in each one of these kind of strategies of data collection. So this is where I'm going to kind of shift from sampling and measurement to a couple of other things, so I'll pause for a moment for any questions you all might have. Not so far. So the boundary specification problem is something that then becomes a kind of big question. It's a big question for all kind of primary research data collection projects, but in networks it's slightly kind of elevated, because if we're trying to figure out what we're interested in terms of a population, for boundary specification in a network problem, this is simultaneously a dual question, right? Which nodes do I want to include? And which relationships do I want to include? And simply because I can identify the boundary of the nodes does not mean that I can identify the boundary of the relationships, and vice versa. Right? This is a question we have to kind of address kind of on both levels simultaneously. Ed Lauman and some of his colleagues are the ones who kind of initially kind of labeled this problem, and so they get the credit a lot of times. One of the strategies we frequently kind of rely on for resolving the boundary specification problem are what are known as kind of either the realist or the nominalist strategies, right? So a realist strategy for the boundary specification problem says, I'm not going to try and figure out as a researcher who and which ties are inside the population. I'm going to let that come out from the data, from the people that I gathered this data from, right? So it's very kind of a subjective perception of those people inside the data that allows us to figure out where the boundaries lie. Right, so I'm just going to start asking the questions, and once I start kind of identifying where people kind of cut off who is part of this and who is not part of this, that's how I'm going to figure out where I define my boundary. The kind of alternative strategy is frequently, and I'm kind of describing these in kind of the ideal typic versions. The nominalist version is basically an exogenously identified population boundary, so I can say, this is a classroom. I can identify the relationships amongst the kids in this classroom and the kids who are not in this classroom. I'm not going to worry about those relationships. And the reality is both of these have limitations, right? So just because there's a seemingly very strong and very useful boundary that we can do in kind of a nominalist approach doesn't necessarily mean that boundary in practice is as hard and fast as I, as an external researcher, might assume. So one example I'll mention, one example I'll kind of describe of that is, so there's, some of you may be familiar with, there's a project on Lakoma Island in Malawi. Islands seem like a good boundary, right? If we're going to study, particularly in this case, it was sexual relationships. So they kind of enumerated all the sexual relationships amongst people in 17 villages on this island. But the reality is in some of those villages, most of the people had relationships on the mainland. And so it doesn't become a hard boundary. And it's only certain villages that was true for, whereas other villages, the boundary was very strong. So even the hardest boundaries can be sometimes somewhat porous. Something I always want to highlight when I talk about the boundary specification problem, this is something that when we talk about it, people have this tendency to think that it's really something only that concerns complete network data. And that's not true. The boundary specification problem applies to all network sampling designs, ego, partial, complete, equally, because if I ask for an ego, if I'm studying an ego network, if I ask a particular kind of name generator, maybe I have particularly assumed in the way the question is asked that we're going to set up a boundary that excludes particular people, and respondents might not interpret that boundary the same way. So you really have to think kind of relationally and nodally how the boundaries are adjusted as you estimate these sorts of things. And it's not just for surveys as well, this is for other sorts of data collection strategies. So some potential limitations to the boundary specification problem. This is data from Emmanuel Zega and some of his colleagues, where they studied kind of collaborations and advice seeking in labs and organizations. And so you could very quickly, I'm sure, think if you're trying to study collaborations within a lab, people who collaborate outside that lab, which could potentially lead to kind of very porous boundaries, or seek advice outside of those boundaries. I just mentioned the Lacoma Island example down here. Ad Health is a prime example of this, right? If we're studying relationships within schools, some schools that makes a lot of sense. I went to high school in a relatively rural area that looks a lot like, if you've used Ad Health data, Jefferson High, where I think it's something like 90-some% of the relationships that people reported were within their school. Another big school in Ad Health that gets used a lot is one that gets labeled as Sunshine High, where I don't remember what the percentages are of that, but that boundary is very porous. A lot of those kids report most of their friendships being outside of the school, right? So if I want to then try and model what's going on in terms of the relationships within the population that is seemingly well-bounded, we're going to get really different estimates for schools where the boundary is porous versus where it's relatively, what's the opposite of porous? Bounded. There we go, that one works too. Thanks. So in addition to just kind of definitional things, we can also end up in kind of just practical limitations of the ways the boundary specification problem can kind of rear its head analytically. So let's suppose we have a well-bounded population like Ad Health that uses a roster-based study. Well, people who are left off of the roster, who are part of the population, can lead to all kinds of potential limitations very quickly. Particularly if we've got people who are, if I have a respondent who's part of the population and they're not on the roster, as soon as I start naming friends, one of the things we in networks like to study very early on is what's known as reciprocity, right? If I name a friend, do they name me as well? Well, if I'm not on the roster, we're gonna have a potential deflation of reciprocity in this population because I'm naming people who could not possibly name me. Right? And so the off-roster problem can be problematic for respondents in that way, and it can be similarly problematic for nominations. So if we start naming people who are not on the roster, but we're naming the same person, right, then the capacity to get what are known as, what we describe as closed triangles would be reduced because I'm naming someone, you're naming someone, they happen to be the same person, but we can't identify they're the same person, and so we don't know that those three people are connected. So you can end up with kind of deflated estimates of network characteristics because of these kind of off-roster problems. It can also inflate the number of nodes. So if I start naming people who aren't on the roster, I can assume they're somebody different. So you have to do kind of either some post data collection cleaning, or sometimes you don't even have the capacity depending on how much information you have. Somebody who's done some really interesting work on trying to reduce these problems, actually there's two, April Young at the University of Kentucky, and Stefan Hellringer has done a lot on kind of how we can reduce these kind of data muddiness problems in kind of post-collection data cleaning processes. But it can change all kinds of things, right? It can change both kind of who's in the network, what the relationship structure of those people in the network looks like, and even kind of global network level characteristics as well. Where are we at in time? I'm going to skip this slide because it's mainly, I'll mention it really briefly. This is kind of this is not by no means a systematic thing. This is kind of some reading from a book by Martina Morris on kind of data collection strategies, and some of my kind of thoughts on kind of various questions of kind of control and difficulty of actually fielding studies that are ego partial or complete. The main thing I will point out here is on the inference step here. Jim made what seemed like a little bit of a side comment yesterday, but I think is really huge, is the question of inference in networks is very frequently a large question of kind of what is our in, is something we sometimes have a big conundrum about. So just because we have a complete network with 1,500 people, if we're then studying the network processes within that network, the question is, do we have 1,500 people or do we have one network? And depending on the types of questions you're after, it very frequently is the case that the inference we're asking is more alternative versions of the same population rather than thinking of kind of generalizing from that population to others like you're used to in other contexts. So you really sometimes have to think about kind of what you have the capacity to infer to, and in complete networks, sometimes it's really that network and that population, not so much others of similar structure. So I'll skip past most of the rest of that though for now. You all did talk about this yesterday. Usually when I talk about data collection, I kind of step through a little bit of what are known as bipartite or two-mode networks, but I won't go into too much detail of that since Jim went into some detail about that yesterday, but you can kind of get actors through events and various things. The one thing I will add is it used to be the case when we analyzed bipartite networks that we would almost always project from the bipartite network down to a one-mode network of either the actor by actor or the event by event. But increasingly what we're seeing over the last 6 or 7 years is people who have developed methods for being able to analyze the actual bipartite network and not having to reduce down to a projection, because there's a lot of information lost when you move from the bipartite to the projection. Sometimes we do, particularly for really large networks, we have to kind of do this, but we're seeing methods that are capturing things like a clustering coefficient means something, or triadic closure means something really different on this network than they do on this network. And so developing methods that allow us to analyze the bipartite network as a bipartite network has become really important developments of the last handful of years. Another thing that I didn't see coming up anywhere, so I thought I would just add it really briefly, is something that is known as cognitive social structures. Cognitive social structures is an idea that was developed by David Krackhart in the mid-'80s. But what he recognized is it's not always just salient for me to be able to get estimates of what people report their own relationships look like, but sometimes in some populations, it's more interesting to learn about what everybody estimates the relational patterns amongst the entire population to look like. And so what David Krackhart did for a while was he would ask people to report not on their ties, but on every tie amongst every other person in the group. This is probably only really possible in relatively small groups. So what we get is a stacked set of adjacency matrices. So this X111 is person one's estimate of the relationship between, that's probably not a good example, let's go down to 211. This is person one's example of the relationship from person two to person one. This is person one's estimate of the relationship from person one to person two. And so I've got as many adjacency matrices as I have people in the population is what you've gotten. It's each person's estimate of the relationship structure amongst individuals. And usually we don't actually ask it this way. We don't ask people to report on every cell in that adjacency matrix. We'll ask them to report on what are the groups of people you know who hang together or something like that. But you get different estimates. And what we've learned is that for some questions, these perceptions are more salient than the actual self-reported relationships amongst the population for certain outcomes. One place that a lot of this work has been done is in educational circles. So kids and teachers' estimates of the relationship patterns amongst the kids in a classroom are more predictive of educational outcomes than are the actual friendship networks amongst those kids in a classroom. It's something that Karens and a guy named Matt Patinsky has done some work on. Some really kind of fun stuff. It also has led us to a number of other conclusions, most of which I'm going to skip past. But the main one thing that's kind of a punchline here is, as you can imagine, if network data collection is tough to do in the first place, if I'm asking everybody not just to report on their own relationships, but everybody's relationships, it's even more time expensive than traditional network stuff. So it's only kind of really viable in limited populations. So that is kind of a lead-in for me to a really brief discussion of a few other kind of modes of network data collection. David Schaefer, who will present later in the week, and some of our former colleagues at Arizona State developed a variety of methods where they were trying to study preschoolers and young kids and the development of kind of relationship patterns amongst them. And so what they did was they trained a whole bunch of grad students to basically take a tablet. This was a while ago, so it's a big tablet. And they were observing kids through the day at Head Start and other preschools and watching who they played with through time, right? And they were coding up relationships amongst 3- and 4-year-olds and being able to estimate kind of friendship networks amongst these kids from external observations. And this is kind of the interface that they use. But David and some of his colleagues have a paper on kind of the fundamental principle on kind of how networks form amongst 3- and 4-year-olds. And I don't know if he'll present on this, so I'll really briefly kind of summarize something that I think is kind of fascinating in this. 3- and 4-year-olds were exhibiting reciprocity in their friendships, and they were exhibiting transitivity in their networks in terms of these friendship groups. So people who were friends with two people, those two friends became friends over time at 3 and 4, and those effects increased across the school year. So transitivity got stronger from the beginning of the school year to the later part of the school year amongst 3- and 4-year-olds. So they're saying some of these processes we're used to talking about a lot in networks start really early. It's kind of the punchline of that. So we can use kind of external observations as a way to collect data that allows us to estimate these processes in useful ways. As I briefly mentioned and will come up in various other things you'll hear across the week, we're increasingly kind of seeing enhanced network data collection via not just pen and paper, but things like ACASI and others. So the PINS, the Prison Inmate Network Study at Penn State, and like 18 other places, they've been gathering some really cool network data amongst inmates. and also on reentry once they're exiting the prison over the last handful of years, and we're starting to see some really cool kind of estimates of relationships amongst that population coming out of that. And these are particularly useful because we might require some level of kind of sensitivity to privacy, et cetera, amongst this population in the data collection. This is a project that actually was here at Duke. David Eagle did some work on studying kind of clergy social support networks. And why I have that here isn't so much to talk about kind of what they learned in respect to kind of the clergy to the GSS comparisons, but something they embedded in this survey was a kind of multi-method approach where they did kind of phone, mail, and web surveys, trying to estimate same sorts of things, and enumerated some of the similarities and some of the differences of what comes out of these different approaches to data collection. And so this was kind of a more methodological enterprise to kind of think about what differences might arise out of these things. But it can also lead us to thinking about how we can use these as potentially complementary sources to get the same information from multiple platforms for a single study. So I found it as a particularly kind of useful way to think through how we might stop just thinking about one data collection strategy and think about multiples to be able to get at a single question we're ultimately interested in. And something we're seeing a ton of recently, and this particular example comes from a student that recently defended his dissertation at UTMB, is we're starting to see a lot of use of archival. I shouldn't say start. That's dating myself. Now I feel old. We've been using archival network data for a long time, but we're starting to see different kinds of it used more commonly today, I should probably say. So this is an example from Medicaid data. Where basically what he did was took a Medicaid data and was able to encode up physicians on, this is practicing kind of minimally invasive breast biopsy practices, and he asked the question of kind of how physicians might be connected to one another via the number of shared patients they have in common, and so we can draw networks. This, I believe, that's Dallas. And then we can ask questions about kind of how network structure changes over time with respect to those kind of shared patients. And you see some weird things in some areas and some relative stability and kind of network structure in others. I'm not going to talk about exactly what's going on in this graph, just to say that using these kind of archival sources to generate networks of shared patients from things like Medicaid data is something we're seeing all over the place these days. So I always find it, particularly when I'm giving these sorts of talks, I always find it useful to kind of give you a number of repositories of places where there's lots of good data out there. And I bet anybody making this list would end up with a different list, other than in the social networks world, most of us are going to have Lynn Freeman's list because there are all the data sets that, well, at least 10 years ago, we were all trained on. So we play with these data sets a lot. Katya Ognyanova has recently compiled a whole bunch of data sets that bridge a lot of different fields, and that's one I would highly recommend. If you're just trying to think about kind of what's possible, it's one of the reasons I find these especially useful. But that list is kind of all there in your slides. I said I'd talk about ethics really briefly because you have an entire section on it later in the week, but I always feel like if we're talking about networks and collecting data, I can't kind of just skip past this. So the example I always kind of start from, and talk about this really briefly, is this is the story from Slate that accounted for how Saddam Hussein was found. And if you've ever been a member of the SocialNet listserv, it for a long time was the case that about every 9-10 months, there would bubble up a big controversy on there about how we should be using network data, right? Some people are very frequently, kind of very vehemently asking the question, are we comfortable with thinking about making predictions for individual level outcomes, hiring and firing practices, searching practices for military uses and others, and thinking about kind of the implications of these things as a conversation that very frequently bubbles up. And I'm not trying to kind of come down in one way or another. I'm just saying that it's something that we think very carefully about. There was a special issue of this in 2005 that we all cite from Ron Brager, and there's another one coming out soon. But the things I think that are important to think about are kind of informed consent and deductive disclosure are things we usually talk about in kind of general human subjects research. They're really different in the network's context, which I suspect you'll hear plenty about later. Anonymity and confidentiality is just something that's very different for us in networks. We rarely, if we're not working in the ego network context, we can almost never really truly have anonymous network data. We have to kind of work hard to think about what confidentiality can potentially look like. And I think one of the things that this discussion frequently kind of hinges on is where is our usefulness? Kind of, are we trying to describe things? Are we trying to predict things? And if we're trying to do either one of those, at what level? Something we're pretty good at in the networks community these days is making aggregate level descriptions and predictions. we talk about how good we are at translating these to sort of individual level phenomenon, we're not as kind of far along in that world. So the kind of ethical considerations that come along with that are particularly primed at kind of protecting against kind of inaccurate or kind of potentially harmful individual level kind of applications. So I'm just going to leave it at that as kind of the seed for things you ought to be considering. And then we now have, what, about 20 minutes left by my clock to get through some of the examples I have for evaluating social network data. My intent was I would probably throw more in here than we would have time for. And we, do you want a break? Is that what you're saying? Sounds good. General Social Survey Important Matters kind of changed in the number of isolates that we observed from 1984 to 2005. And people immediately asked, did we really see more than doubling of the people who are isolated? And so Claude Fisher implemented a kind of experiment where what they recognized was that in 1985, the network module was more or less right in the middle of GSS. In 2004, they realized that the Important Matters network module was at the end of the GSS. Not only was it at the end of the GSS, it also followed on a module that was about organizational participation, where everybody who named organizations that they were members of, they were primed to realize they were going to be asked follow-ups on each organization they named. And so the question became, was there kind of a learning effect that led to this doubling of isolation, where people who just didn't want to answer any more questions started giving fewer people? And so what Claude Fisher did was implemented an experiment where basically they replicated the structure of the GSS from 1985 and from 2004, and they conducted it in 2010. If you have the slides in front of you, you already know the answer that I'm getting ready to give you, and that is that in 2010, if we replicate that, we more or less replicate exactly the difference that was observed across these. So this was largely a methodological artifact, the isolation figures. The rest of the shift in the distribution that kind of moved left still remained. It was just the isolation figure, not exactly, but it was a reduction. It was really just the isolation effect that changed. And furthermore, Pike and I don't know how to pronounce Sanchagrin's name. They found furthermore that this was the result of, I think that it was 6 interviewers or 2 interviewers. I forget which study it was, but this was the shift here was largely not even kind of respondent learning; it was interviewer learning, and so you had interviewer effects contributing to that particular finding. But there have been other people who've picked up various things in this thread, kind of asking kind of what's going on in this isolation question. So in one of the best named papers in the networks world, Cloning Headless Frogs and Other Important Matters, Paolo Parigi and Peter Bierman estimated that this isolation, whatever the actual number is, something they learned is that about half of people really don't have somebody that they can talk to about important matters when they report being isolated. Another half of those people said they would have had someone, but they didn't really have anything important to talk about. So this kind of isolation effect, while we only have one question, can lead us to kind of combine kind of 2 very different sorts of information into a single question is something they've learned. Another thing that kind of comes out of this paper is a lot of work on kind of what those important matters look like, which is where the title of the paper came from, because one of the people said they were talking about cloning headless frogs. And so this led to a question of kind of how important are important matters? As people are talking about these sorts of things, and can we really kind of estimate kind of the potential kind of social capital uses from these very simple instruments? And some people have kind of looked at this and said, well, if we're talking about where we could get a haircut or kind of cloning headless frogs, do we want to think of that as kind of objectively important or not? That's up for debate. And I think they kind of left it up for debate in this paper, so people have picked up this thread again, and Matt Brashears has shown in a number of ways that some of the most trivial topics that people are reporting on, talking about, can provide very useful kind of indicators of social support accessibility that people have. So just getting people to tell you kind of who the important people are they talk to, regardless of what the kind of content of that relationship is frequently a good proxy. What he's suggesting is frequently a good proxy for what we are after in the first place. Who are the close people I could rely on for social support if needed, which is what that important matters kind of question is thought to be an initial proxy for. So another way we could think about social network data is, this is from some work Jim and I did when I was a very early grad student, is in the networks world, very often, if we have a single person respondent here and they're reporting on some relationship, that other person might be part of the population as well. And in that case, then, if we have multiple reports of the same relationships, then we can use those to estimate kind of how reliably information is reported. And so what this table is doing is saying, given this person says the relationship exists, if this person's also in the survey, what do they say about that relationship, right? And so for sexual relationships, about 85% agreement. For social relationships, about 80% agreement. For drug and needle sharing ties, a little bit worse. But something we realized is something I mentioned briefly earlier, is that most data collection actually has kind of some window of reporting that they're relying on. So I don't just ask kind of who have you had these relationships with, but I ask in this particular study, I think it was 6 months, if I'm not mistaken. They asked kind of who did you engage in these partnerships with over the last 6 months. And so if we account for the fact that people could have non-overlapping windows and therefore could actually be telling you discrepant information that is truthfully discrepant, what we find is the agreement levels go up once we account for making sure their windows overlap at least a little bit. And so people seem to be reporting, the way we took away from this is people seem to be reporting kind of on their relationships with a relatively fuzzy, accurate time window. They don't get it exactly right, but they're kind of fuzzily estimating these things. In a lot of network data collection projects, we don't only ask people to report on their own relationships, but the relationships between others, right? So if this is the respondent down here, they could be reporting on the relationships amongst their partners or even relationships their partners have to other people. And so we could ask these questions in two different ways. This person says this tie exists. C or A is subsequently interviewed. How often do C or A agree? Right? And so what's going on here is this is saying that for sexual relationships, if I say my partner's involved in other relationships about 81% of the time, they also report that same relationship. For social relationships, we're kind of not particularly good at reporting others. And I think that's because we overgeneralize the assumption that our friends are friends with one another. But we could ask the question the other way. C and A say the tie exists, does R agree, right? So this person is saying they're engaging in a relationship, I'm connected to them somehow, do I report that same relationship? And what you see is relatively high agreement on the drugs and social relationships, relatively low agreement on the sexual ties. And this is because, well, sexual activity, even in this population, was a relatively hidden activity, right? So I'm less likely to know about things that I'm not privy to, is what that can kind of lead us to conclude. So this kind of, one of the punchlines here is we can, if we're gonna ask people to report on things amongst their partners, we should ask them to report on things we can reasonably expect them to know, not things they don't. And so there's been tons and tons of studies that have done this kind of work, starting with Bernard, Kilworth, and Saylor, that show that frequently concordance on these things is actually a lot lower than we saw in the population in the previous slides. One thing we've kind of come away with this is the more kind of salient relationships are frequently more kind of reliably reported than less salient relationships. But other things we've learned is that like recency and timing and anchoring improves reliability. So the relatively recent, relatively specific relationships I'm better at reporting on. I do better at reporting ongoing relationships than dissolved relationships. Marital relationships are frequently better reported. This is good, right? People agree when they're married. But it's something we've tested. In a variety of samples. Single partners, people who have single partners are more reliably reporting on those partners than people who have multiple partners. Longer term, more reliably reported than short term. And there are substantial gender differences, one example of which I will talk about later. This is a paper by Stefan Elringer and some of his colleagues where they showed kind of the impacts of these different assumptions about how we deal with these concordance estimates for estimating things in networks. In this case, they were estimating concurrency in sexual relationships. And we get different estimates of concurrency depending on how we assume discordant reports can be used within that population, is what that paper is showing. I'm not going to go into Stefan's solution for dealing with this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Weihua An and one of his collaborators' work in South Africa, where they basically said, if we've got these 4 networks, we could take all of the original reports and just record them as what we're going to estimate from. Alternatively, we could do what people have done historically is one of 2 things. I eliminate ties that are discordant. If 2 people are both involved in a relationship and they can't, then their reports lead us to different conclusions. Some people have just dropped that report as kind of, we don't know what to do with this. Other people, Devin Brewer has been one who's particularly kind of argued for this. The symmetrization approach is saying as long as one person reports on it, I'm going to take it as fact. I don't care what the other person says. And so you can kind of think of these as intersection and union sets. But what Weihua An and his collaborator did in this is they said, well, if we have all these multiple reports, what we can do is back out an estimate of kind of the credibility each one of these respondents has for any one of the tie reports they provide, right? And so they give a credibility score to each one of these nodes based on the kind of population level agreement across all of their relationships. And then they provide in this paper 6 different, and I'm not going to go into the details of these, but 6 different strategies of how we could ultimately use those types of credibility scores, and then using data that has potentially discrepant reports. And they kind of give a deterministic strategy. So I'm just going to take the most credible person's report, regardless of what it is. Or there's kind of a random or stochastic method where basically they say, I'm going to take kind of a random draw from the distribution of credibility scores of whose report I'm going to use if they are discordant in their reporting. So there's lots of different strategies for how we deal with this. I'll come back to a few more in the last slide of this talk. Given time, we probably don't have time for this one. This is a fun little paper, though, showing how people remember networks. It's in Nature Human Behavior by Matt Brashears. I'll point you to it with the reference at the bottom. And skip to this. So missing data in networks is something that, to be frank, for a long time we just ignored. I'm overgeneralizing a little bit, but we knew it was a problem, but we really didn't know what to do with it, so we just kind of barreled ahead in a lot of respects. This has changed a lot over the last 15 or so years. To ask a lot of questions about kind of what's going on in missing data within networks. And the first problem that we had to estimate is how common of a problem is it? Because frequently in networks, we don't have the capacity to estimate this as easily as we might in other data collection strategies. So I do not have time to go into details here. So what I did with the slides was try to give you kind of pointers to people who have provided answers to kind of some of these really important missing data questions. And I'll highlight some of the kind of broad notions of this. The punchline of this is, well, a lot of it's missing because in networks, we frequently are going to have many more relationships possible than we have the time to either collect or elicit from populations. So what this has led to is questions about kind of what types of network data are more likely to be missing, right? I've already mentioned one finding that's come out of this a lot, and that is more peripheral network members and more central network members tend to have more censored information than those people who are somewhere in between the periphery and the highly central positions. And there are lots of other ways that network data are missing in particular ways. Jeff Smith and Jim Moody have done a lot of this, and then there are people like Georgi Kucinets who have done a lot of work on kind of really big networks in answering these questions and how these kind of sampling biases affect different types of networks differently. And that's a really important thing, is these biases really have differential effects across different scales. So if I'm talking about a network of 100 people, I have really different expectations about how network data are going to be missing than if I'm working with a population of 1 million, and in between even more differences across these things. So I don't have kind of good, solid, kind of, it's always going to be X answers for you here, because it's really different across those different scales. The one thing I will point out about that is, additionally across those scales, the kind of tie-level stuff tends to be relatively similar, but the kind of structural, more kind of full network information tends to vary more substantially the larger the network gets in terms of what's more likely to be missing. So this has led to a lot of different strategies for how we deal with missing data. I was looking at Jim's slide from last year, and he said one of our most common strategies is we ignore it, and that still is very often the case, but we ignore it, I think, now a little bit more in a more principled way than we sometimes used to, because we've started to see a lot of more kind of strategies for identifying other strategies and kind of being able to work out the implications of those for approaches. So kind of the main things that we could talk about are modeling-based strategies. So if we have incomplete data, we can use kind of models that you'll hear about later in the week to kind of fill in those additional bits of information through ergoms or other sorts of models. We can do kind of more classic multiple imputation strategies that just kind of try and build out from the information we have to other information we don't have. There are more kind of Bayesian approaches, and one that I think is a particularly clever approach. Jennifer Watley-Neal did some work using those cognitive social structures we talked about earlier, really briefly, and said if we think about cognitive social structures as potentially representing information about the network that individuals might not have access to, we can use that to supplement the individual level network data that we have, which she cleverly then calls cracking the missing data problem, because it's David Crackhart. Anyway, the punchline here is that dealing with missing data in networks is quite difficult. There are lots of different strategies, and nobody really has kind of a single answer of which one of these is best. across the board, in many of the methods you will talk about through the week, there are kind of best practices for, like, if you have a centrality problem you're after, how you would deal with missing data for centrality is different than if you're trying to deal with how you're going to run a stochastic actor-based model and deal with missing data in that context. It's going to have different implications. And so those kind of lead to different parts of this. So the last thing I wanted to kind of leave you with is kind of a fun, kind of interesting finding from the sexual behavior literature that's existed for a long time, where for a long time we've observed in many network data collection projects that women's reports in aggregate of the number of partners they have would lead to, if we compare them to men's reports, it would lead us to suggest somebody's lying, that women are underreporting, or men are overreporting the relationships they have, which leads to clever titles like this. But there was a paper by Devin Brewer and a number of his colleagues that came out in PNAS about 18 years ago, where they point out that if you account for the level at which high degree actors are undersampled in a general population survey and adjust for their high activity, what you would find, based on prostitution in the United States anyway, is that that discrepancy between men and women goes away almost entirely. In their particular sample. So it's not a reporting problem, it is a sampling problem, where they had mismatched pairs that we frequently think are matched, and they are by and large, but if they aren't at the tails, it can have big implications. And so sometimes in the networks world, while we might want to make these kind of direct comparisons that seem clear, it doesn't always indicate kind of poor match of the actual data that we have. It's just we've got different comparisons. So I will leave there with, I'm out of time. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I also will mention that I'm in the process of writing the little green QASS books on network data collection. So hopefully you'll see this in about a year. We have time for
questions. We get a show of hands. How many people are planning to collect their own data in the near future?
Holy cow.
Seek each other out.
That's awesome.
And talk to us about your design, and talk to each other about design. Jimi said this early, pre-test early, often, and again.
And post.
It's remarkable about how important it is to pre-test if you're doing your own data collection, especially if you're actually interviewing people as opposed to doing archival kind of stuff. But even then, really make sure you know what you're collecting it. But there are a lot of people around here who have experience collecting network data, both on the ethical side, on the pragmatic side, and the rest of this. So please, seek us out, seek each other out, and make sure we get some good. This is the time today, tomorrow, this week, before you go in the field. See people like Jimi out who spend a lot of time doing this, and make sure you get your questions answered before you do it.
I just want to comment, the hands that went up, that's almost an exact inversion of proportions from when I started teaching these sorts of things. We all relied on secondary sources, so that was encouraging for whatever it's worth.
That might actually get caught in your tail. Make sure you actually need to collect.
That's, yeah.
Go to certain sites and you can answer your question first in that data, or at least augment it.
Yes.
All right, let's catch some. Oh, go ahead.
That example, the ad health example, where people are primed to list five friends. What is there any sense of, like, if most of the high school students really have 3 or 4 best friends, and then they're sort of struggling to okay, I have to come up with a 5th, so they list a 5th, and then you want to get sort of an aggregate. How close are you to your 5 best friends? But that 5th person, they're not going to be that close to. So it sort of distorts what the measure would be. So
I overstated the case a little bit for illustrative purposes. The mean number of friends is not many people are capping out in ad health, right? It's in the 3s. I think it's like 15 or 20% we're capping out. Is that on that order?
Yeah, same sex, it's a little higher.
Right.
They're capping out, but cross-sex almost never. And so I don't think there's that much of a...
People aren't even getting up to...
So what?
A really nice paper by Alice Wolfowski and Peter Hoff looking at what they call the fixed rank nomination data sets. And ad health is a fixed rank nomination. You say your first friend, your second friend, your third friend, and so forth. And it turns out that that's actual information, right?
Yes.
There's something about the ordering of those friends that matters in terms of the tie there. And you can look at things like changes in reciprocity across the rank orders. And they developed a specific statistical model called the fixed rank nominations model, which is a variant of Ergo kind of models that takes into account that extra information. And so if I list you as my first friend and you listed me as your fifth friend, then we might not expect the same kind of reporting consistency on the things we did together, right? So it's a really nice way of looking at those kinds of models, and it's worth thinking about.
And I mean, it doesn't seem the case, like you said, that they were kind of reaching the caps of this Scrum. Like, there is some suggestion that anytime you produce a kind of explicit cap at all, that you might inflate. So if the number was like 3, it might have been more like 2.5. But I'm not talking like that it is jumping to the top. It's just that it adds a little bit, particularly for people who are more likely to anchor to whatever it is the question prompt is specifically asking about, which is going to be different by respondent, right? Back.
Yeah, so I came in a little bit late and I apologize, so I may have missed this. But when you were talking about the HIV discussion networks and generating names of people that
Yep.
the respondent you talked to about HIV, I wonder if it's common to, instead of starting with just the name generation, actually starting with the roles of it. Like, so do you talk to family, friends, and have them indicate that first? And then drill down into who those people are to kind of solve that problem of, are they just naming people of convenience, or are these really like advice givers to this?
So I can speak to that directly from the Malawi data. I mean, this is the question you're asking is one that really is any one of these choices is going to lead you down they're kind of there's path dependency, right? Any one of these choices is going to lead you to a different kind of conclusion. And in that case, one of the reasons we had household rosters, and so we have family and we have kind of a lot of relational and kin information in addition to this particular name generator. But a lot of the people at the time we were collecting these data that people were talking to about HIV were non-family. And so the types of ways you would select who you're going to kind of find underneath is going to be very different in terms of your context. So in that case, we kind of came away thinking maybe we should have started with friends first and then gone to HIV discussion partners. But we had there's a lot of reasons not to do that as well, because people were seeking out experts and people were seeking out based on other things. And so how those kind of trade-offs lead to different kind of assumptions of how these different types of relationships would be associated with one another is going to be very kind of context informed. And so while I kind of punch holes in our measure a little bit in what we're talking about here, we are pretty confident that was the best way to kind of proceed in that particular context for these trade-off reasons. I'll look to one of you all to end. So, all right.
Thank you.